going up. Stop. Enough. Enough. Oh, that turned it off. I didn't want it to turn it off. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's having a great day. I'm going to try and put that up there where it's not like right in the way. Since it actually worked yesterday, I thought we'd go live again today and see if it was working again and make sure that, it's functional. So we're here. You can follow along over on YouTube where I have websites open so that you can actually see, depending on what I'm talking about, because some things are book-based, not website-based, and not article-based. So you can see, depending on what I'm talking about, what is actually being talked about, and see links over on the YouTube. And we covered almost all of this yesterday, except for a couple of things. And so I'll probably start on those things today, but I'm going to give it just a second as we get started. And as I'm waking up, because I am just waking up right now. So when we're looking at some of these things, let me try and make sure I've got everything set right, because some of the things will kick us out or cause problems. Okay. I don't think that it has. Okay, so I think that's set up. I want to make sure that everything's set up as we're going into it. And since we're still pretty low, what I'll probably do is just go ahead and get started. If we start hitting like above 100, then I'll go ahead and go over some of the boundaries within the space, just because if we're this low, most people tend to already know what my boundaries are in this space. And so I don't have to worry too much about it. But once we get up above like 75 to 100, sometimes I do need to like tell everybody what the boundaries are within the space. And then let me go ahead and I'm going to start right today. And I think I've got to find it, but I know I have it over here. I do. Let's start today on the rise of violence. And if you're following along on YouTube, there is a couple of articles on my website that talk about how violence was rising. And this first one, now I'm going to open it up and make sure, because of the fact that I haven't read these articles in a couple of minutes. But I want to make sure that this is the one that I was looking at and the one that I actually have kind of quoted a couple of times. I mean, not word for word quoted, but kind of given evidence from a couple of times. And so let me double check some of it just to make sure, because I always like to make sure that I'm doing the right evidence for right now, right? Like I'm very open and honest about what today says might be tomorrow's difference, right? You know, might say something today and we might find out tomorrow that that's completely wrong. I also really want to make sure that I'm doing my best to give us the as much of the correct current facts, right? Schmuck too, with schmuck. That's an interesting one. So yes, yes. Okay, so this article that I have up right now, though it's going to be the top article and it's not opening in the website. Let me switch the shared tab really quick in YouTube so that you guys can see it. And this is an article that on the Ancient Science website that I have, or on my Widda Ord website, which Widda Ord is everything at this point, like all of my stuff at this point. If you just type .com after it or put it into YouTube, you can get to where you need to be. So this is underneath the Rise of Violence tab, underneath bibliographies on my website. And we're looking at the rise of violence and what one of the articles that we have on that website states. I'm going to actually kind of give a little bit of a kind of rundown on how you can validate whether or not you should look at an article, whether or not you should actually like you can actually use that article for a positive reference of source, right? So this article, as we're looking at it on YouTube, it's going to give you a couple of things that's really going to solidify whether or not you should be looking at this article or taking this article as a factual article, right? First one, this one is pnas.org. This is a scientific site. PNAS is a pretty scientific, very reputable scientific site. So it always yells at me when I set them, so I'm not surprised. And so this is a very reputable site. At the top of this page, not underneath the website's little tabs, but at the top of the article, it states that it's a research article and it states what it's under. So this article states anthropology because it's an anthropological article. And then it gives the title. All articles are going to give a title. This one is Conflict, Violence, and Warfare Among Early Farmers in Northwestern Europe. And then this one, and this is one thing you want to look at too. It gives 4 actual authors on this article. It is really unusual for you to find a scientific article that only has one author. And part of the reason that it's really unusual for you to look at a scientific article that only has one author and it be a valid one, like a valid scientific article only having one author, part of the reason that that's very rare is because science requires lots of different specialties, lots of different areas of focus to understand one theory. When we look at the Cerruti Mastodon site, the reason that there is a lot of validity to the Cerruti Mastodon site is because it's not just a paleoanthropologist who studied it. It's also a ontologist, which is somebody who studies animal bones in the Paleolithic. And it is also, there's a couple of geologists on it. And there's people from every different field. And the having people from every different, or not every different field, many different fields. The having people from many different fields means I, as an anthropologist, I'm really crappy about DNA. Like that doesn't register in my brain. So if I'm going to do something with genetics, I need somebody who registers what DNA is. If I was to do a study on how we can trace DNA here in Turtle Island to other places and to like Denisovans, or to look at the ghost species in Turtle Island DNA, I would need to have me and also have somebody who's really good with genetics and really good with DNA. And then if I was going to try and trace that to a southern boat route, I would also need somebody who's good at paleogeology. So the geological history of our planet, because they're going to be able to show me where land masses are forming or where land masses have sunk over the last 50,000, 70,000 years. And so I'll need to get together all of those different disciplines to form a whole. So when you're looking at a scientific article, you want to make sure that there's more than one author of that article, unless you're looking at something that has no cross-disciplinary influence, or you're looking at something where the person is specifically using a lot of other people's research, which is totally valid, right? Like, so if I am going to write a paper or submit an article, I'm going to go look at probably hundreds of different articles and different research from other people. So if I'm doing a lot of quoting other articles, I might not have multiple people who are coming to write the paper. That's your problem, dude, not mine. So this article itself has 4 different authors: Linda Berger, Torben Ahlstrom, Kristen Meyer, and Martin Smith. And then the next thing that you're going to want to look at on this is the date. In paleoanthropology, in anthropology, in any field that studies our evolution, anything 20 years ago is almost completely out of date. And people, you know, like it's not something most of us think of, right? Like I'll have people throw articles at me from 40 years ago on DNA. And I'm like, dude, that has nothing to do with DNA today. Like that 40 years ago, DNA was so in its infancy that like they couldn't do ancestral DNA. They weren't even doing DNA testing on everybody regularly. Like, so if you're looking at something that's 40 years ago on DNA, it is so far out of date that nothing in it is really going to be valid to your modern day or current timeline of discussion. So when you're looking at these articles, you want to make sure that these articles are up to date. And one of the cool things on pnas.org is that this article says this article has been updated. If you're watching along on YouTube, I just like highlighted this button. This article has been updated, and you can actually click on it and it will show you what has been updated. Let me double check that you guys can see that just properly. You can. Okay, perfect. Though my picture's in the way. It will show you what has been changed and what has been adjusted. And again, as we were talking about earlier, we have so many things coming through right now that everything is changing day to day, day to day, day to day. So you're going to expect there to be some changes if something is more than, a year or 2 old, right? And even then, there's a possibility of a lot of change. This one was submitted first in July of 2022. I'll show you over here where it says received July 2022, right? Accepted in October of 2022, right? So it doesn't have the publication date on this, but it does. This January 17th, 2023 is when it's been updated. Because if you click on the when it's been updated, it says January 20th, 2023, the SI appendix have been updated to correct. Okay, so actually the 17th was probably when it was published first, and then they updated it on the 20th. It can be different on different sites, right? So this is how you can look at an article and know that the article is going to give you relevant information. We are above 50 here, and I have seen a couple of trolls, so I'm going to go ahead and do kind of my little opening spiel. And I might have to repeat it later, so just so you know. This is my space. TikTok gives everybody who has 1,000 followers a live space. I came into TikTok because I was sent here by many members of many different communities to start giving education. One of those things for education is helping people who are of European descent find their own ancestry so they're not appropriating other people's ancestries. Another thing is to ensure that my many communities, because I am very, very mixed, but my many communities have information that is not out there commonly. And finally, for me, is to kind of ensure that everybody has some information that I've been able to gain access to. I'm in my late 40s, and I have spent my entire life studying anthropology and archaeology and medicine and history. I learned how to read in anthropology texts, and I went on to get degrees in medicine and in anthropology. I am a war vet who's disabled. I have days I can't walk, and so I don't work anymore. And instead of working, what I do is express my passion. And my passion is knowledge. My passion is who we are, and my passion is understanding. I, like many people, went into anthropology, archaeology, the history or discovering of who we are, trying to figure out why we are and what we are and when we are, right? And in that, I've found that we're biologically nurturing and communal, that the idea that there's an evil that lives inside of us is false and about trying to control you. And I've also discovered that for hundreds of thousands of years, we were a very communal, loving, animistic people. And roughly 10,000 years ago, as we're just discussing, the rise of violence happens and we become what we are today. And it has been a failed experiment every step of the way. I've also found that we've been scientists since before Homo sapiens were around. Homo erectus themselves were scientists, and it's kind of Homo erectus is science that gives us our brain and gives us the ability to move forward. In my space, because TikTok gives me my space, and this is my space, it's my room, and in my space, I get to set my own boundaries. And my boundaries in this space are, I don't deal with racism, and I don't deal with hate based on gender, desire, things like that. I'm not going to deal with those things. Race theory has been debunked. It was a horrific theory that was created by my field, and it is my field that has debunked it. And it was created to cause harm to people and to justify the atrocities that old European white men have been committing for hundreds of years. And it's no longer accurate. It was never accurate. And it's no longer in play. Racism is in play. Absolutely. Culture and ethnicity exist 100% and should be respected. Race, though, has been debunked. I'm not going to deal with your racism in my chat. I know it exists. I'm doing my best to make sure it doesn't exist everywhere or anywhere, right? Like, let's get rid of that thought process. Okay, let's see. And then there are 3 biological sexes, right? Male, female, and intersex. And gender is based on my own self-perception. It's not based on anything you think. My gender is not based on anything you have to say or do, right? It's not about you. It's not always about you, right? In my space, I don't deal with those. If you think I'm wrong about something, that's a good possibility sometimes, right? Like, I don't remember everything accurately. I'm human. If you think I'm wrong about something, please let me know. But let me know in a way that I know what you're talking about. Don't just tell me I'm a liar. That doesn't do any good for anybody. Say, hey, Widda, that's incorrect. This article shows. Or, hey, Widda, have you heard this? Because that debates what you're saying. And I can answer that, and I can interact with that, and I can have some form of, either informing you why, yes, I know that that's out there, but this is more correct, or learn something myself. Because for me, it is all about new knowledge. New knowledge is one of those things that just gets me going, as it should every single one of us, because creativity and the quest for knowledge is actually one of those things that is uniquely Homo sapien, is uniquely human, right? Currently uniquely Homo sapien. In the past, of course, other human species have had that quest for knowledge as well. So now that we've gone over the spiel, let's go ahead and go back to the conversation that we were having about the rise of violence at 10,000 years ago. So when we see the rise of violence at 10,000 years ago, the rise of violence really cross-correlates with the start of the building of agricultural-based cities. Cities based on monocrop agriculture. Let me restate that. Rise of violence is in correlation with the rise of monocrop agriculture cities, not just agriculture, because agriculture comes in many different forms. Monocrop agriculture cities and animal husbandry that includes a lot of herd animals, right? We see even in the very beginning, these cities were poor living situations, okay? We know today that hunting and gathering actually provides more sustenance for less time worked than any form of monocrop agriculture. Hunting and gathering is in and of itself its own form of YouTube. It has cut down on me over there. Let me get back in. I apologize. TikTok has been having some problems with me lately. I don't know what's going on. I mean, not like I'm getting banned or anything. But TikTok has been, let me see if I can do it again. I can't. It hates me. TikTok has been pausing on me, and I've had to restart my TikTok a lot. So the freeze is on my end, everybody. I apologize. It might happen 2 or 3 more times over the course of the next couple of hours. Yesterday, it only happened like 4 times. This has been something that's been ongoing. I've been doing everything I can to try and figure it out. Well, I've had several different pictures. It has nothing to do with that. Well, and it's not like I'm getting reported. It's a totally different thing from being reported. It actually will shut down the entire app on me, and I have to go and pull up the app, and then it just pops me back into resume the live. Oh, that makes me feel better that it's happening to a lot of other people, because I just figured I'm searching through my hell house trying to figure it out. I've done so many things over the last 2 weeks trying to get it to just stop shutting down on me. Okay. Well, that makes sense. That makes sense. Oh, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought about that. Thank you, Irony. Thank you, Irony. I'll have to look at that this afternoon and get one download or get one interactive. I haven't been using them at all. I mean, I've heard about them obviously for a while and thought well about them for a while, but I'm so technologically challenged that I just, between being Gen X and growing up in the woods, I can still hear electricity in walls, right? But I'll do that this afternoon because that's an awesome idea. That's probably what it is. And I know which one that one is too. I've heard of that one. I mean, let me write it down so I make sure I remember, because I'm shit on that too. So mine? Am I sounding bad, or are you talking about my tattoos? I don't know. So when we look at hunter-gathering society, we see that within hunter-gatherer societies, right, or collection societies, because hunter-gatherer or collector societies are basically the same style of society, they just do it a little differently, right? Both of them hunt and both of them gather. One just moves to do it, and one stays local and then goes out and comes back, right? Has a satellite. When we look at hunting and gathering, we see that it's about, it's Owen. It says speak out in Irish Gaelic. So when we are looking at the way that food and nutrient and care for the community happens within hunting and gathering spaces or collecting spaces, we see that it's about some studies, like studies on the, and I cannot say this word to save my life because I do not do clicks well. It starts with a click, but it's the Kung tribe of Australia. They actually, their hardest workers work 16 hours a week. Like that's their overworking, right? Most people work like 8 hours a week in a hunter-gatherer society to provide all the nutrients needed for the community. And that includes, the cooking and the making of clothing and the making of tools, right? So when we see the first start of monocrop agriculture anywhere along I am familiar with the King's List, but I'm only slightly discussing Egypt. So I'm also familiar with the King's List in the Middle East, and we'll touch on Sargon, but, so when we look at the change over into monocrop agriculture works really well along the Nile River, where it's first seen around 18,000 years ago. And that's because every year the Nile floods. And when every year the Nile floods, it replaces the nutrients in the area. And every time it replaces the nutrients in the area on a yearly basis, and I think it's actually a twice yearly basis with the flooding of the Nile, but I could be wrong. But every time the nutrients replace, it gives more positivity to the soil. You can grow a crop. So if you clear out everything else and just put that crop in, there's going to be nutrients coming in from the Nile that are going to give you the ability to grow crops in what is otherwise a sterile environment. When you instead take that into a space that does not have yearly flooding, and you pull everything out of the biome where it's at, and you plant a monocrop, all the nutrients. See, plants and animals, as they interact in the ground, they form a biome, like part of the broader biome. And that biome within the soil actually creates nutrients for any plants coming in. And this is why you've probably heard of the Three Sisters agriculture within Turtle Island indigenous communities, and why when you're looking at tending land instead of monocrop agriculture, you'll see that certain plants will grow in concert together. A lot of time when you're doing even monocrop agriculture, they'll tell you to plant certain plants together, because by planting those certain plants together, it'll help give nutrients to those certain plants. And so when we're looking at monocrop agriculture that comes in and pulls everything out and replaces a singular crop in that area doesn't give nutrients to the crop it's replacing. And you're not getting my hand. Stop it. Doesn't give nutrients to the crop that is in that area then. So when we see monocrop agriculture starting, monocrops, you have to get up before dawn and go out. Make sure your weeds are gone, make sure you're carrying water to your space, putting water all over your plants, checking your plants. It is a daily activity from, before the frost has left the ground, because you're going to want to start tilling your soil before the frost has left the ground, till, even after you've harvested, because after you harvest in the fall, you have to again till the soil and try and get ready for next year, so that when you're trying to get through that frost laden ground next year, it's a little bit easier, right? So it is something that from winter to winter, like this end of winter to the start of winter, is a 24/7 daily activity, right? Like it is wake up in the morning before the sun, go to sleep at night after the sun. And it is every single day. It's not something that you get a couple days off for, right? If you're not just, one field, you have several fields usually, and then you have other animals, so there's a lot of work. So imagine going from a time when 8 hours a week is enough to where 8 hours a day is not even close. Well, everybody gets like the turn of the seasons except for along the equator, right? It might be, I don't know if the Nile is along the equator. I think it might. Geography is a challenge for me. I am not a great person with geography. Let me see if it's south of the equator. It rises south. So it actually goes across the equator. I do know from being in that region, there is winter in that region. Like I was in Iraq and Kuwait in 2003, and we got there in February of 2003, and it was freezing cold. And then it warmed up in like June, right? So, well, maybe it was May, right? So I do know that, you might not have snow there, but you're going to be really cold in many desert environments. And in fact, it can be a lot colder in some desert environments than you would think, because of the fact that there's not a lot of break. Like if you're getting any wind, or if you, like just the intensity of the chill without having any form of insulation. Like trees provide insulation, right? So, yes, yearly flooding along what river in West Africa, though? And it's important to note, like, as I was just saying, why would you want to go from 8 hours a week to 8 hours a day? 8 hours a week of abundance to 8 hours a day of toil, right? So there are places where Western-based agriculture would probably work really well, or where monocrop agriculture would probably work really well. Yet people wouldn't choose. Like, they're looking at you going, that's stupid. Not only that, it's so unhealthy for your body. Like, let's be real here, right? So when we see they start the monocrop agriculture along the Nile, it works really well there. It kind of moves out into what we know of today as Mesopotamia, well, we knew of it as that as well then. It's in the Iraq area currently. And it starts moving out into this area because this area at that point of time is extremely fertile. It's extremely green. There are a lot of rivers where the Tigris and the Euphrates come together. There's a lot of lowland, a lot of kind of wetland at this time frame. So we see that people are doing monocrop farming in this area since about 14,000 years ago on. But they're doing it like your community of 30 people has a couple of acres that you have monocrop on, and you have some beasts that you herd, and you are still doing some hunting and gathering, right? There's this crossover between the two for quite some period of time. I swear, little dog. There's this crossover between the two for quite some period of time. When we move to about 10,000 years ago, there is some shifts in the environment that many people out there think gave rise to the use of monocrop agriculture. For me, I don't really think that that's what it is. I think that somebody got an idea and utilized that idea, right? Because even with this shift in the environment, was it not supportive as many people in certain areas? Yes, but there were other areas that were more supportive than they have been before, right? Because of the way the environmental shift is happening. This is the Younger Dryas, and this is about 13,000 to about 11,000 years ago, I think. Let me double check on the date on the Young Dryas. So 12,900 years ago to 11,600 years ago. So it was a very short period of time, between 12 and 13,000 years ago, basically. And during this time, there's this shift seen. There's this shift seen across and it's really starts in this area. This shift is in the Arabian Peninsula, right? And in northeastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And part of the Arabian Peninsula is still way more connected to Northeast Africa at this point in time. They are still very much the same continent at this time. So, I'm sorry, I'm too used to talking about 50,000 years ago. The water would have been lower in the Mediterranean, or not the Mediterranean, but that's the Red Sea. The water would have been lower, but it wouldn't be very much a part of the continent of Africa. That's 50,000 years ago, and I'm way too used to talking about that period of time, and I apologize for that. But the water is lower, so there is more connection, and there is more space along the sea where you can grow stuff, or where you're seeing habitation, not necessarily growing, but seeing habitation. So as we see this shift going from the Nile at 18,000 years ago to at 14,000 years ago, there being some small farming communities along, different rivers in the Fertile Crescent, to 10,000 years ago when we see the rise of our first city, which is Angazal on the River Jordan. This is the first agricultural-based city that we have. It's really the first city that we have. We do see things like Göbekli Tepe and the Karahan Tepe that just came out in the last couple of years. But we haven't counted those as cities. We count those more as religious centers of worship and gather, because we don't see any evidence of permanent living within those space. We see evidence of returning, but we don't see evidence of long-term livability, right? Like, it's not like somebody's building a house and you see, years and layers of stuff. It's like, oh, every fall they come out and, this is where they come, because you can see that the timeline of when they're there. You can tell those things out of what plants and minerals are in the soil at the time, what animals are killing, like, do you have babies at this time, baby animals at this time, or do you have adult animals at this time, right? So you looking at that, you can tell a lot more about where and when Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe have been used. So the first agriculture-based city, the first city that we see would be Angazal, and it's along the River Jordan. This city, it's put in a basin that's extremely fertile along the river. And for 300 years, it works. But at 300 years, it's caused such climate destruction in this space along the River Jordan that they have to move on, right? They have to go somewhere else. They're no longer working there. And we see that Angazal has actually re-risen several times, roughly in the same location, right? And this is one of those, reviving cities that are out there. So Angazal has not had continued occupation for 9,000 years, but it has had repetitive occupation for 9,000 years. The first 300 years, though, we see that what they're doing was taking and ripping all of the nutrients, all of the environment or the biome along the riverbed up, and they were planting it with barley and wheat, the monocrop agriculture that we're seeing at this point of time. My dog is really, really needy today. Please stop. Where's a toy? Give me just 2 seconds. I'm going to see if I can find him a toy so it will give me a little bit of a break. Where's your toy? Go take it. Yeah, come on. I hear you, creature. Okay, Brian, you scooch over. Scooch. Thank you. I know. Hold on. Let me see. So, thank you. Is trying, must have more knowledge. Really, the reason is because the more knowledge we have, the better we are able to overthrow that shit, right? The better we are able to burn it to the ground. The more we know, the more we can take care of each other and take care of the bullshit we're in. So, they rip out the entire contents of the valley. And when they're ripping out the entire contents of the valley and replacing it with monocrop agriculture, shh, don't you dare. You're not going outside. Come here, creature. Yeah, I know. Come on. The ripping out and replacing with monocrop, they lose fertilization in the soil. They can't fertilize the soil enough, right? And so the area becomes infertile and they can't actually. One more second. You can't go out. You know you can't go out. We will lift this up so you cannot touch it, but you cannot go out. All the animals. So because they have removed all the nutrients from the soil and they can't replace the nutrients in the soil fast enough because they don't know what they're doing, because they can't replace the nutrients in the soil fast enough because they don't know what, it's still really early. Of course, using animal manure and stuff like that, I'm sure that there's some concept of it at this time, right? Some concept of fertilization. I'm not exactly sure when we really come across our concepts of refertilizing the soil. I don't really study agriculture itself that much, right? So because they've pretty much denuded the area and ripped everything out, it's absolutely impossible after 300 years to get any fertilization. And because they've been herding their animals all over the hills, they can't go up into the hills either, right? So they end up losing the city. It comes back after a few hundred years. Now, when we're looking at this, we see that when things are written down, the start of writing, most people will tell you, is in Mesopotamia, but actually the start of writing, up until last year, the start of writing was really in like hieroglyphics in Egypt, right? Last year, we actually found that there's evidence of writing in caves at 23,000 years ago. So, and there's a pendant that was found last year or the year before that has evidence of writing on it, that one might be 21,000 years ago. And then there's some evidence that Neanderthals actually had some form of tracking system or writing system, because there are like lines and dots that are now being looked at as, oh, well, maybe that's what that was, right? So when we're looking at writing, we tend to, first of all, history is anything after writing. Prehistory is everything before writing, right? Written word is what history is. So history is the written word. So everything prehistory is everything before writing. That changes depending on what area of the globe you're in. If you're looking at Mesopotamia, we're looking at about 4,000 years BCE when we start to see the first writing. So about 6,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years BCE. When you're looking at Egypt, we start to see the first writing in the hieroglyphs about 1,000 years earlier than that, right? So, good morning, DeCray. So when we're looking at that, what we're seeing is that at the first start of writing, what you get documented in the first writing in any area that you see a start of writing in is the histories, the stories. Across the globe, since before sapiens, across the globe, there has been the ability of science within us, right? Like our very first stone tools, the adaptation is science. The ability to control fire that Homo erectus has is science. The very first clothing thought processes is science, right? And as we adapt those adaptations further, we get more science, right? That's all it is more science. And it is literally science that gave us the first stone tools and the first adaptation of the stone tools all the way to our phone. Those stone tools and that usage of fire is how we have our phone today, right? So that's not true. That's not true. And again, that rhetoric is racist, and I don't like to deal with it. And I'm not saying you're intending that, but that rhetoric is racist, and I don't want to deal with it, because that rhetoric falls back on Graham Hancock's theory of in ancient Atlantis, ultralight people from the South Pole who their world collapsed, and so they had to go across the globe and teach everybody the same fucking shit because people can't come up with their own shit on their own way. Our first buildings are going to be stacking blocks on top of blocks, right? So if everything turns out to be somewhat pyramidal in shape, that's because stacking blocks on top of blocks works. It stabilizes, it stays stable, right? And when you look at all of these pyramids across the globe, some of them are called pyramids, but they're not even pyramids. A pyramid is a square that comes into a point. There are no squares that come to a point in Abiyala. There are rectangles that come to a point. And the styles are utterly different. Utterly different. They have nothing in common, right? And so when you are sitting there and deciding that it was the same between here and here and here, instead of seeing the differences in them, what you're doing is A, monolithicizing an entire fucking people's 3 or 4 different peoples with some very different cultures, right? And B, supporting the white supremacist rhetoric that states that it was white people who gave that information to everybody everywhere, and that's why it's all the same, when it's not the same. It's not. If you look at the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the Egyptian pyramids, they are completely different than what we call pyramids in Peru or Tenochtitlan, which is still rectangular in shape and has like these big, on the corners of it, has like these big blocks, right, that are art up the corner of it. None of them are made to be inside of here. They're not made as burial grounds here. They're made as temples here. And none of them have any, like the art is all along the outside, and the art is significantly different, right? Chat, you need to take that out of my chat. I am not dealing with the Wabu theory rhetoric in my chat. It is racist. It is white supremacist. And I am not dealing with it in my chat. You will take it elsewhere, or you will be muted and blocked. So, I didn't know you weren't. You've been for so long, I didn't know you weren't on the new one. You're like, you should have a moderator. And I'm like, aren't you? Wait, guess you're not. Like, let me see. I can answer that question really quick, but then I'm going to go back to the rise of violence. Okay, so ghost species are, the 7 cousin species are like Neanderthal, Denisovan. I'm going to go over them really in the order which we found them. We found Neanderthal in 1850. And then for the next 150 years, 200 years, we thought that they were the only other species. No, you're fine. You're fine, sweetheart. I'm going to go over it. I don't want to get off track, and I squirrel easily. So I'm just going to go over it and then try and come back on track. Not like you've done something wrong. Ghost species are pretty cool. Lily, so it is collective consciousness, but it's collective consciousness of a single community, right? Or civilization. It's the collective consciousness of a civilization, not the collective consciousness of a global civilization. Does that make sense? So, Diva, what am I appropriating? Or are you a Wabu? If you're a Wabo, you can do what the last one did and take your ass out. So when we are looking at the 7 different species that we see in us alongside us in the fossil record, we see Neanderthal first. Then in 2003, we find Homo florensis. And Homo florensis is a small species, about 3'5", with very large feet, that is on the island of Flores in Indonesia. That shows us that we actually had to cross water to get there, because the island of Flores has never been accessible by dry land. That was in 2003. In 2010, we found Homo denisovan. In 2010, we started doing Svante Pablo sequenced the whole genome of Neanderthals. He was able to do ancient DNA and sequence the whole genome. He won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, the year before for this. And in sequencing the whole genome of the Neanderthal, they did that out of Denisova Cave, because Denisova Cave is littered with bones. And so they started searching at other ones. And in their search, one of the fingertips of phalange actually turned out to be an entirely new species. And that's how we got Denisovan. We've only found roughly like 10 pieces of Denisovan. Everything kind of fits in the palm of your hand except for a mandible. We found a base of their skull, which actually shows us the imprint of language, because language, the pathways for language can be mapped in your skull and are in your brain, and the imprint of your brain against the interior of your skull can be read later on, right? So, okay, let me answer that one. What do I attribute the massive civilizations of civilizational accomplishments of Europeans compared to other societies? Name me a civilization accomplishment of the Europeans specifically. Of the Europeans. I really struggle to think a civilization accomplishment of the Europeans. Nope, they didn't do that. It was done by the Polynesians first. Nope, they didn't do that. It's done by the Polynesians first. Rome is not a civilization accomplishment. It is not European, it's Mediterranean. Greece is not a civilization accomplishment. And again, it is not European, it is Mediterranean. Colonialism. Art is one of the first forms of communication, but we were already vocalizing. Fire comes from Homo erectus. Homo erectus is who gave us fire, and they're in Africa when they do it. DNA, the ability to test DNA is a cross-cultural ability, and it doesn't necessarily come from Europe, though there are probably a couple people from Europe that have worked on it. It is literally cross-cultural. It is not just Europe. Modern media does not come from Europe either. Medicine was found by Europe last. Everywhere else had medicine before Europe had medicine because they're God. Thank you, dragons. Like, Europe literally stamped out medicine and science, and everywhere they were at for 1,000 years because their God said it was bad. Well, everybody else kept medicine and science. Literally, people would have to leave Europe to go to Muslim countries to learn medicine and science because you couldn't learn it in Europe. I still haven't seen an accomplishment that is a validly European accomplishment. So, not seeing an accomplishment that is a validly European accomplishment, we'll move on. So after Homo florensis and Denisovan again was in finding the whole genome, actually computers, I believe, are here, which is not Europe. No, physics actually does not start with Europe. Physics is science, and science does not start in Europe. Science starts in Africa, again, with Homo erectus. Didn't airplanes come here first? Like, wasn't that Orville and Wilbur first? I mean, literally, you guys are now talking about American accomplishments, not European accomplishments. And most American accomplishments aren't by people who are only European. A lot of them are by people who are African and European, or people who are Native American and European, right? Yeah, science in Europe was eradicated for 1,000 years. That's why they had to go and appropriate it from everybody else, because they, their God said that science was evil. And so they killed anybody who practiced science. That's the burning times, right? That's the burning of the witches, because the witches were just scientists, right? And to eradicate science because their God said science shouldn't be there, they literally killed anybody who practices. Their cities were disgusting. They didn't have actual irrigation, or not irrigation, sanitation. We had sanitation here in Turtle Island. White Americans are not usually only European, as I said. I challenge you to find somebody who has had their family here in the Americas, in North or South America, for more than 2 generations that is 100% European. I challenge you. Because every single person in the United States or Canada at some point has a Black or an Indigenous ancestor. Absolutely. And it is because of the way that colonialism works in the United States. 100%. It's why every single one of these white people freaking out getting that 3% Black on their DNA, right? Nobody here is pure anything. And that ideology is kind of disgusting too. Just saying. So, and literally like the people who, like the woman who invented the web, the World Wide Web, yeah, she's probably majority European, but that's not all she is, right? Like all of those things. And you know that it is literally African women who helped build the first computers. It is because of a Black woman mathematician that we made it to Mars. And only because of a Black woman mathematician that we made, not Mars, the moon. And only because of a Black woman mathematician that we made it to the moon. It's only her, right? So all of your permaculture is Turtle Island indigenous. Permaculture is an indigenous thought process being, again, appropriated, right? So after Neanderthal or after Denisovan, the next one that we see is Homo luzonensis in the island of the Philippines, the island of Luzon in the Philippines. Homo luzonensis, like Homo florensis, is a shorter species. Their height is like 4'8" at its most, but I haven't seen anything on having big feet yet. There are dwarves though, because you know it was Lord of the Rings thousands of years ago. And after around the same time, we find Homo luzonensis. They reclassify Homo longi. So Homo longi was thought of to be a Neanderthal skull, but now they're thinking that it is actually either an entirely new species or it is a Denisovan skull. Until they find Homo longi is based on a skull cap that was found in Long Cave in China in the 70s. And they don't have anything but the skull cap. They can't get DNA out of it. And with Homo denisovan, we don't have a skull cap. And really the majority of what we have is DNA. And so until we either find a similar skull cap and get DNA out of it and compare it and it's Denisovan or an entirely new species, we will not know if Longi is a new species or is Longi Denisovan. Within the last 6 months, HLD6, and let me go ahead and actually bring HLD6 up on my I'll really quick bring this up. This is on my webpage under the bibliographies. This one is going to be New Humans. And let me I'm going to pull it over onto the website that we're looking at. This HLD6 is, if you're looking on the website, you can see a couple of really significant I apologize. Again, TikTok is being hateful. So I did pull up HLD6 over on the website so you can look at it on YouTube. And if you're looking at it, you can see some really significant things right off the bat if you know anything about us, right? We are the only humans that have had a flat face. And we are the only species we know that has a chin, the mental eminence on our chin, right? And what this is, if you can feel it, right? Your chin just kind of sticks out here, it juts forward, right? Everybody else is kind of sloped back, right? So with this, you can look at HLD6 and see it kind of has a flatter face and it kind of has the start of a chin, which is really, really interesting because this is 300,000 years ago in China. So this may upend a whole lot of things over the next year or two. There might be a whole lot of changes over the next year or two because of HLD6 and what HLD6 might actually represent, okay? That's not who I'm talking about right now, but I can absolutely do that. Over on my YouTube, I have up a website, and I'm talking about that website itself currently. This behind me is Denny. We're not talking about her right now, but I love her. Oh, I did it again. Let me give you back the YouTube. It's just in such a small little space. There we go. Now we cover her eyes, right? There we go. So he's not an archaeologist. He's a journalist, and he's racist. He's been touting the same things for 30, 40 years. They have absolutely no evidence. And he's using a lack of evidence to state that there is evidence. And all of it's based on his theory that white people are the reason that everything is what it is. That brown people had to be taught by white people to have the simplest basic understandings. So I have no truck with Graham Hancock or his theories. So I haven't heard of the lost Denisova melanin coloration. I haven't heard of that yet. I'll see if maybe I can find something on it, but I haven't heard of that. So that's the 7 that I call our cousin species. Now, why do I call them our cousin species? I call them our cousin species. I have to move this so I can see myself. Otherwise, it weirds me out. Don't ask me why. I have no clue. Our cousin species, and so that I can also see the things. Our cousin species, we have why I call them our cousin species. We're all descendant of Homo erectus. So in the last year, we've learned that speciation through convergence is how we speciated and how Homo erectus speciated. And speciation through convergence actually gives us this, I wonder. Okay, so there's a lot of Denisovan and Australian indigenous people. I haven't heard anything about different colors, undertones coming from Denisovan. It is possible. If you look at indigenous Australians, they have a different undertone than indigenous Africans. They're still what we would classify as Black, which is really shitty, or not really shitty, really a simplification of a classification, right? Really simple, right? We're all brown. Every single one of us is brown. We're just different shades of brown. And some of us have different undertones along with those shades. Like you might get a copper undertone, or you might get a golden undertone, or you might get a purpley undertone, or you might get kind of a bluish undertone, right? So maybe that, but I haven't heard anything on it, right? So when we are looking at those, I call them our cousin species, the 7 species, because we are all descended from Homo erectus. We speciate through a convergence of several different species. So Heidelbergensis, Antecessor, Ergaster, Erectus, all come together to kind of speciate into us. And these other species don't actually speciate from multiple species like we do, to our knowledge currently. But they speciate from the species that were our parents and our siblings and our aunts and our uncles, right? So I think of them along the lines of cousins, just because it kind of gives us a simplification of how the web of the family tree is actually playing out, right? So when we're looking at that simplification of how the web of the family tree is actually playing out, it really gives us that ability to conceptualize how speciation is happening. That's why I use cousin species. Now, the ghost species, and just like you can see a fingerprint of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA in our DNA, just a couple genomes, just a couple genes that might affect skin color or might affect the way we breathe, like our oxygenation in different altitudes with Denisovan, or might affect the tenseness of the finger, if you've seen that thing on the Viking handshake come across lately, or might affect how we react to diseases. Just how we see a couple of those genes in our genome, or might affect our skin, like Neanderthals themselves have a allele for dark skin and an allele for light skin. So you might have a Neanderthal allele for dark skin or a Neanderthal allele for light skin, right? So when we're seeing those little pieces of fragments of DNA in our genome, we also see little pieces of fragments of other DNA in our genome that we haven't found a species in the fossil record that has the full genome that this associates with. So think of it as like a couple of genes from another species. And we haven't found that species in the fossil record. So we call these ghost species. We know that they're from Earth, right? They're absolutely obviously terrestrial species, right? They are species that we haven't found in the fossil record. We don't have a full DNA genome on them yet, so we call them ghost species. We don't know who they are. We don't have a name. We don't have any ideas beyond, oh, we see these little fragments. So we have 7 of them. 3 we see in the Kwe people of South Africa and the Yoruba people of West Africa. And those are 3 ghost species within those 2 groups. Those 2 communities are also the only 2 communities on the planet who do not have Neanderthal DNA. Everywhere else on the planet has Neanderthal DNA. The rest of Africa has Neanderthal DNA. Those are the only 2 communities on the planet that do not have Neanderthal DNA. We also see 1 ghost species in Indigenous Australians, 1 ghost species in Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Abayalians, and the 7th and 1 ghost species in Neanderthal and Denisovan, and that we don't see in us. And then we see 1 other ghost species that's coming along with HLD6. And I haven't gotten all the details on where that ghost species is yet. So I'm not exactly sure. I just know that they came out with a new ghost species that they see. I'm going to kind of think it's in China because it's along with a discovery in China that they found it. So I would think that it's probably in people in Asia. I haven't found out the actual though yet, so I don't know for positive that's where that is. So those are the ghost species that we have, and those are the cousin species that we have. But I'm going to go ahead and get us back on our conversation about about the rise of violence. And again, you can find the links for these on my website, as well as right now we're going over them on YouTube so that you can actually see some of these articles as we're talking about them. When we're looking at mundane, what's your message? I love ghosts too. They're kind of cool. If you're trying to like say something directly to me and it doesn't seem like I'm hearing you, you can at me and it will pop up so I can hear you too, right? Just because. We do want to make sure that we don't repetitively put the same thing in chat because it makes it difficult for other people. We also want to not use caps because it makes it difficult for other people. And we do try and stay on topic so that we don't squirrel the Widda, because Widda will squirrel, and that's not always the most positive thing. So we do ask those things, and my mods will ask those things. But if you have like a question or something that you want me to see, you can totally at me and it'll help me see it, right? Oh, yeah, no, that makes sense. We were talking about ghost species, not actual ghosts themselves. So just so you know, like, and like I was saying, they're just kind of like a ghost in the shell species, right? Though if you want to hear more on it, that's, like it's not the ghosts that we all love and know. It's something a little bit different, but it's kind of like a ghost in the shell is kind of how I think of it. But we do want to go ahead and stay centrally on topic, which, I mean, I see your question because your question was, you heard ghosts and you're like, what the heck? That's ghosts. That's my thing. Right? It's, So when we're looking at the rise of violence, I don't know if you were in here before we got onto the species, but what we're looking at with the rise of violence is the start 10,000 years old. And what we had gone through was the talk about how Western-based or monocrop agriculture causes climate destruction, and how it caused climate destruction in the first cities that we see that are based upon it. We had kind of gone down into the first writing and had a conversation a little bit about how we judge history as the start of writing is the start of history. Anything before the start of writing in an area is prehistory in that area. writing or history means written story. So it literally is just written story. It starts when we're writing stories. History starts, right? So we see that the first histories that are being written down in this area. Now, it's important to note that the Egyptians had hieroglyphs before cuneiform was formed. Cuneiform is not our first form of writing. Hieroglyphs don't even seem to be our first form of writing within the last couple of years, because there looks to be some writing in cave walls and in cave arts that date back, 20-something thousand years ago. Serpent, that's a really cool thought process, but I don't know if I know, right? Like I don't know how we would actually rate that until we can actually find a hide in the ground, right? So first of all, everything that degrades is biodegradable, right? Like leather, things like that are going to degrade really quick in the archaeological record. We might be able to okay, so recently they started doing this thing where they can pull DNA out of the dirt, right? So maybe in I think what they do with that, from my understanding, is they'll do a core sample, and then they'll pull DNA out of the core samples. So if they were to do that and pull evidence of a hide itself, right, of a piece of leather, right, it would probably be pulling DNA from the brain tanning usually uses the brain of the animal. It can also use urine from a human, right? So maybe if we can find a hide that they pulled the DNA of the animal, say the animal's like a elk, right? So they pull elk DNA and they pull human DNA, but they pull it out of the same slice of earth, right? That might give an indication that you have a tanned hide, a urine tanned hide, right? So something like that might give us the ability to judge when the first hide is tanned, right? But we would need something like that. Like it's not going to be something that's easily distinguishable. We do know when, we first started to utilize some form of a clothing. We also now know or have some idea of when we first started to actually make clothing that fit the body instead of just like throwing a hide over us and tying it around us, right? I personally am going to assume that by the time we're sewing our clothing, we are tanning the hide first. The reason is because if you are just, letting it dry out, it really becomes a little stiffer, and you're not going to be able to sew it really, right? If you're just letting your hide dry, or if you're just tossing it on you. I mean, I guess you could toss it on you and sew it while it's wet still, but that's not going to, suffice as easily, right? So when we're looking at that, it's, it might, I would say that by the time we're starting to sew, we're probably tanning, but I can't say for definitive. Yes, humans do have ghost species DNA within them. That's how they're ghost species. We see them within humans, but we haven't found the whole species in the fossil record yet. So we see that after we see the first cities start to rise, when we get to the point that cuneiform is starting, that they start documenting the first kings in the area, and their documentation of the first kings in the area is the documentation of violence, and it's the documentation of narcissistic personality disorder, if you actually look at it. So the first king that is documented in the area is Sargon the Great. We've, probably all heard of this person, at least partly, and it is actually Sargon's name that is used in Lord of the Rings, right? Sargon the Great is, the story of Sargon the Great is extremely familiar to everybody, though we hear it under different names. The story of Sargon the Great is that he was put in a basket as a baby and floated down a river, and a gardener or tender of the land pulled him out. Sometimes it's the king's gardeners and there's already kings. Sometimes it's just a farmer, right? and they pull him out of the river and they raise him, but they raise him very poor. They raise him in a way that he doesn't have a lot, right? And so he's kind of abandoned as a baby, and he's abandoned as a baby, which causes a lot of psychological damage to anybody. And he is raised in monocrop agriculture, which, as we just described and discussed, is an extremely hard scrabble living. It's hard, right? It's much healthier for us to be hunter-gatherers. It's much less work for us to be hunter-gatherers. It's much safer for us to be hunter-gatherers. But he's raised in a monocrop agriculture family, right? By somebody who is farming monocrop agriculture. So his upbringing is going to be one of dearth. It's going to be one of lack. It's going to be one that lacks things. And so he forms this idea that he is the child of a god. And in his forming of an idea that he's the child of a god, he actually forms the idea that he's the child of the river goddess. And as the child of the river goddess, it is right for him to be a god king. He gathers together friends and people and basically forms the first protection racket. And it's really with this first protection racket that we see the rise of agriculture-based cities. Because what we see is, I'm going to protect you from the barbarians in the hills who are going to come and steal your goods. And so you have to pay me in grain so that I can feed my troops, right? So that I can protect you. It's kind of that mob boss mentality. Apologies. Oh, and it didn't give me my background. 1 second while I fix the background. This is actually going to pause me for a hot second because I've got to find it. Okay. Sargon. King Sargon the Great. He's in our earliest writings like Mesopotamia. Yes, that is the correct spellings, Leo. I don't have my books right now. They're all in a box in storage. Otherwise, I could pull it out and show it to you. But we see that Sargon actually, decides he's a child of a river goddess, and he basically takes over as king, right? In the tales where there is a king, the king is failing, and so he takes over as king. In the tales where there's not a king, he just kind of gathers everybody together and starts ruling and gathers people together in cities. Now, we see that these first cities, those on the lower end of the newly formed hierarchy, because this is the start of a form of hierarchy, right? Those on the lower end of the newly formed hierarchy are being kept in check, right? When they're living in small villages, yes. Like when they're still just farming with a few people, yes, they're still going out and locally gathering and locally hunting, right? But when you're looking at cities, no. And the reason is because you're very quickly going to denude the land of any animals. Like if you have 1,000 people in a 5-mile square space, you're really going to quickly get rid of all the animals and all the forageable plants in the area, right? It's not going to be long before they're not regrowing. You're not, especially if you have no thought process of only kill the old and the weak. And when you have 1,000 people only killing the old and the weak, a herd doesn't really work very well. And yes, this is in what is now present day Iraq. It's in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, and Ur. Actually, Engazal is on a river in Jordan. Now, I do not think that Engazal is related. I think it's the further down of Engazal after a couple of different iterations that Sargon is written about. I don't think that we really know which city is Sargon's, right? I'd have to look again, and again, the book is in storage that discusses this, right? I actually have 2 books that one goes over the stories and has translations, and one goes over the archaeological record on it. I'd have to go and pull them out. And I actually, yesterday when we organized, put the box aside so I can do that. So I'm going to do that, right? They were. So barbarians in the hills are actually not usually coming down and raiding people. Occasionally, yes, there's going to be raids, And in those occasional raids, that gives a good story for Sargon to tell. It gives a good story for these first god kings to tell. If I protect you from the barbarians who raided your friends, or, oh my God, that other village over there, it got raided by the barbarians yesterday. They burned the whole village to the ground. They kidnapped all the women and children, and they dug the fields and took all the grain, right? So if I can tell you that a few miles away this has happened, I can convince you that this is going to happen to you next. And so we see this kind of manipulation that it really keeps a lower level of hierarchy people in place so that those who are on the upper echelons of this hierarchy can maintain power. This is the start of othering, and we see this today. It is actually really effective in our society today, and it is actually causing 99% of the problem in our society today. Othering starts with the barbarians in the hills. Fear the barbarians in the hills instead of me, so that you'll pay me to take your grain to kill you. Because really that's what I'm doing, is I'm just exploiting the shit out of you, right? We see it translate into that other nation state is going to come and steal this because we're better than that other nation state. They want all of our knowledge. They're going to take our women because our women are better, blah, 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 blah. When we see everybody's kind of starting to live in cities. And then we see it translate into other based on gender or perceived biological sex, because biological sex, again, there's 3 biological sexes, and the external organs aren't always reflective of what the internal organs are, right? There are people who are born appearing female who are actually biologically male. And when their balls drop in puberty, they're actually able to procreate as males, right? So perceived biological sex. We see that starts in ancient Greece, othering based on perceived biological sex, and is really our first othering within community, right? Within society, so that we're no longer looking as the people outside of society are coming to kill you. It's the people inside society that are going to get you, right? After that, we start to see othering based on religion. And othering based on religion comes in roughly the start of a monothought God, right? So we do see that the very first iteration of the God of the Bible, the Torah, of the Quran, that very first iteration we see, he is actually attacking other people. He's actually giving the Hebrews the right to genocide or attempt to genocide or colonize Canaan. The ancient Canaanites are actually the ancestors of the present day Palestinians, right? So he gives the Hebrews the right to colonize that area. The Hebrews actually, within the Bible state, we don't want to. We don't want to kill people. That's not what we want to do. And he says, well, I give that to you. You go and you take it by force. And so we see this, the othering based on my God versus your God kind of starts there, but it really doubles down after Jesus is crucified and the Romans take on Christianity and appropriate the religion and kind of twist it. And when we see that that happens, that the Romans take on that religion and kind of twist it, what we're seeing is an emperor who is tired of serving with other emperors. He's a part of a triumvirate, though I think at this point it's just 2. There's the East and the West Roman Empire, and he no longer wants to be a part of 2 rulers. He wants to rule on his own, and so having a singular God instead of a pantheon of God kind of gives him a basis why he should rule on his own. And so it was already vile, but they do twist it. I'm not saying that it's that twist that makes it vile. It was vile from the beginning, as evidenced by the fact that he basically told them, go in and kill the Canaanites, right? I don't care, kill them anyways, right? So already vile, right? They do twist it though. And what they twist is the ability for everybody to be it, right? And that twist actually gives them the ability to conquer others and to colonize others in the name of it, in a different way, right? So the Hebrews are only, it doesn't make it better, but still only colonizing one space, right? Whereas Rome takes that and uses it to colonize the entire globe, right? And again, it doesn't make it better. It just means that the twist changes things up. And that twist is also important because Hebrew people have science and medicine. the twist making the single God, the monotheistic thought process that starts the othering based on religion, also takes science and medicine away. Because Rome had science and medicine, Greece had science and medicine, but this mono God, he doesn't want you to question him. And not wanting anybody to question anything, we remove science and religion, or science and medicine, from the equation. Medicine is playing God and science is questioning God. So we're going to take it out of the equation. And in that, we're also able to, they were also able to take anybody who's using science and medicine, like the followers of the same religion, again morphed into Islam, who absolutely practice science and medicine. They're able to make that the evil part. And this is how they start that othering based on religion. Because the concept that science and medicine is bad, you're playing God, you're questioning God, and therefore you're from the devil, right? They can take that and they can twist it into something different, right? And in that, we see that they start othering based on religion. We see that the othering based on religion continues for a while. And by the 1300s, it's starting to translate into other based on skin tone as well. This is because the people, the Islamic people, the Moors, the North Africans, the Caucasians, really, because that is the actual classification for North Africa, Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula. So Caucasian people are actually brown, right? Like Caucasian are brown, right? And so they start to twist the thought process of othering based on religion, and you're evil and there's something wrong with you, into your skin tone, because now I can just see it, right? They start to twist that in the early 1300s. By the end of 1492, in the landing of Columbus on the Taino people and the horrors that are starting there, they document the people in Turtle Island and Abiyala as being extremely pure, extremely good. There's no evil in them. And so they can't document that it's because of evil that they need to keep them down. They start to twist this into othering based on the tone of somebody's skin. We always keep these other otherings. We still talk about barbarians today. Okay. There's so much gender bias and so much perceived biological sex bias, right? There is a lot of religious hatred still going on, right? So we still keep all of the old otherings, we just add to them. And so this is when we start to add the concept. The concept here is actually the fact that the darker your skin is, you're more marked by God as a child of, and I think it's Ham, of a child of Ham who's Noah's son, because Noah's son saw him naked, right? So because Noah's son saw him naked, every descendant of that child is marked, and the mark is dark skin. And so you see it becoming, the darker skin is biblically confirmed for them as being the part of the problem, right? So in the 1850s, when they start to see the theory of, oh, fuck, I'm sorry. I did not mean to do that. This is why I hate having these. And I don't know how to turn it off. Absolutely. Okay, so I apologize. I was not trying to help somebody up here. I don't, this is not a chat. It's not a debate. And I can't seem to turn it like it was supposed to be live, or it's supposed to not do this. So, and it's not like shutting it down either. Yeah, I'm not even. There we go. Thank you for popping down. I don't even know. I can't even like. It's not letting me do things. TikTok just doesn't like me right now. I swear to God. I do seem to be live, but it looked like it was somebody else like it. And trying to decline because I can't, even though I've turned off the guest requests, it's still popping up and trying to decline it, accepted. And I was trying to make sure that it wasn't, because that's not what we were doing. So in the 1850s, we see the thought process of the thought process of evolution coming about with Darwin's theory of evolution, and the discovery of Neanderthal kind of gives us the idea that, we evolved. Well, in this, you can't actually you're no longer in this, they can no longer use the theories of the Bible being only 6,000 years old. And they can no longer, as we're looking at science coming back into play, and the movement away from the Bible as being more fact than religion, they need to find another way to justify their atrocities. And so they develop the theory of race. And the theory of race states that the darker you are, the less intelligent you are, the less pain you feel, the less evolved you are. It's an extremely horrific thought process. And none of it is done with science. It is all done using artistic tools and different biased methods, a lot of confirmation bias, right? They do things like take paper and paint different colors on the paper and then hold it up next to your face, making different colors of eyes and putting, comparing yours to this, and pencil tests to see if the pencil falls out of your hair. All of these different things that really have no value in genetics, right? Really have nothing to do with genetics. Phenotype does not denote genotype. There are people in Scandinavia with tightly coiled hair. There are, people in South Africa whose families have been there for 70,000 years who have light skin. The Kwe people of South Africa literally have the entire human genome in them. Like every genetic that you can find in the human genome is in the Kwe people in South Africa. So you're going to get light skin and light eyes down there, right? So they are taking their confirmation bias and using this to create a theory. And it's not until we get the whole genome project that the theory of race gets debunked. The theory of race gets debunked because there's literally more genetic diversity within a primary population than there is between primary populations. An example, you're going to be more genetically diverse than your next door neighbor, even though you guys have both lived there for thousands of years, your families have, than you are from somebody in an entirely different place on the globe. I use small numbers because it's easier for me, but if we have 100 genes in the full human genome and everybody gets 25 genes, you might have genes 1 through 25 and your next door neighbor might have genes 75 through 100, but somebody in an entirely different country, continent, space is going to also have genes 1 through 25. We see that genetic diversity is higher within primary populations than between. And when you think about this logically, this makes sense. We all know inbreeding is bad. We all know that if you have too much genetic similarity when you're having babies, that you're going to cause mutations, and those mutations are going to cause your children to be sick. And if you go on far enough, it's going to cause your children to die. We all know that. This is why we have laws against incest, right? We all know that too much genetic similarity is incest, and it causes problems in our children. And when we look at this, it really doubles down on the fact that race doesn't exist, right? So after the theory of race becomes their concept of othering, we see it move on. And again, all of these things stay. They're all still there. We're still using all of these otherings. We just add to them. The next ones that we add to it is immigration. Immigrants, people who are escaping horrors, something's wrong with them. Of course, we tie racism into that. And then we start with the houseless. And we have created the houseless problem, right? This is a problem that society itself has created. There have been many societies throughout history who believed in communal care above all else and did not have people who were homeless, did not have people without houses, did not have orphans because they were cared for by the entire community, right? So when we are looking at that, we can see how the theory or the concept of othering, right, how the psychological manipulation of othering has been utilized for 10,000 years to keep levels in check. Because if I can keep you down here afraid of your neighbor, then you're not going to look at the fact that I'm stealing from you. It's that sleight of hand. If I can keep you from seeing what I'm doing by blaming it on your neighbor, right? You know that comedian that's always going with his shirt off, right? And I think it was him. He makes a statement once. He goes, I told him you should never look in your siblings' bowl to see if they have more than you, right? You should be looking to see if they have enough, right? We have lost this concept of we're supposed to be taking care of each other and gone into this concept of mine, 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 mine. How much can I hoard? How much can I take? And because we've gone into this concept of how much can I hoard, how much can I take, and this is such a huge part of today's society, right? It really keeps us in the space that we're exploited. It really keeps everybody exploitable. We spend so much time arguing over, who has the right for this, or you're taking from me, or you get something that I don't get, right? That we ignore the fact that there's people out there who are making money off of that, exploiting us, right? So we absolutely see that the rise of violence at 10,000 years ago, that conflict and that warfare really comes into play with the thought process of othering. It really is doubled down by that hierarchy, and it's really about trying to keep people in check. Now, the article that I had pulled up for this entire conversation, what it goes into is how we see that rise of violence. What we see with that rise of violence is before 10,000 years ago, we have roughly 2,000 individuals that we have found in the fossil record. Of the 2,000 individuals that we have found in the fossil record, under 2% have injuries that can possibly be attributed to violence. What do you mean, possibly be attributed to violence? This means if I find a skull that looks like it's been just so everybody knows, if your name is White Buffalo Calf Woman, it tells everybody that you're not Indigenous, that you're appropriating a culture, that you're stealing from people. There is not a single Indigenous person who would utilize that name. It's dishonorable, and it is extremely dishonorable for you to be doing it. Just so everybody knows, as you're looking through, trying to figure out who to follow, who to be a part of, who to look to, if somebody's name is White Buffalo Calf Woman, run as far and fast as you can, because they're not Indigenous. They are appropriating, and they are dishonorable. Seeing that name pop up, and I've seen so many of that name pop up lately. It's just really good information to everybody to have. They didn't say anything. I just saw them pop in, and I've seen a lot of people, right? No, this nose ring is not. It's hammered. It's ancient. Like the style of it is an ancient style, and actually, piercings is a global thing, including nostril piercings and including septum piercings. They're a global thing, and they're a global thing pre-colonization. And piercings go back to Neanderthal, as well as the fact that I look white. I'm not white. Like I look like I'm white, but I'm not white. So very many reasons not to. Remember, I'd prefer mutes only go for like 5 minutes, just because that way people can come back and say something if they need to, if it's not, so when we're looking at this concept and this thought process, we're seeing that at 10,000 years ago, let me finish that thought process. So what do I mean by could possibly be attributed to violence? If I find a skull that's obviously had a rock hit it here, I can't tell you if a human being was holding the rock or if a cave wall fell in and hit them, right? So it could possibly be violence, but it could possibly be a natural thing. So 2% of things that could possibly be attributed to violence. At 10,000 years ago, we see things become definitive violence I believe it's Kenya 10,000 years ago, there's 8 people who are in a line and their hands are tied. One of them is a pregnant woman. They're all sitting cross-legged on the ground. Their hands are bound like this, and her hands are bound in her lap, and they're all hit from behind with a sharp instrument. So this is obvious violence. You can't attribute it to anything else. So at 10,000 years ago, things start to become obviously violence, and the amount within the fossil records skyrockets. We see it goes from 2% possible to 18 to 20% absolutely violent, right? So we see that violence rises roughly 10,000 years ago, and violence rises because of that interaction, because of that othering, because of that need to hoard, right? That need of hierarchy to hoard and maintain. Yeah, and the skull could have been broken post-mortem, though it's important to note that bone breaks differently when it's wet versus when it's dry. So like the Cerruti mastodon find, you'll hear arguments of people who've never actually looked at the bones who like to claim that the Cerruti mastodon find, you're fine. The Cerruti mastodon find, I'll even make sure that you're not visible on my camera.
I don't care. I want to make sure.
You're fine. The Cerruti mastodon find, you'll see people argue, well, the bones were obviously broken when they were excavated by the excavator. The thing is, though, is the bones on the Cerruti mastodon find are actually broken when wet. You can see a difference in the fracture pattern because wet bone, think of like wet toast versus dry toast. Think of anything wet, it's going to tear, versus something dry, it's going to break a lot more cleanly. And so we see with the Cerruti mastodons find that you can see the wet bone versus dry bone drying out. I am going to go ahead, though, since my partner came in, and take off just a little bit early. I do want to go over something that I try and, hi, Grouch, you're over on YouTube. I do want to go over something that I try and make sure I go over at the end of all of the lives. It's very important to me, and it's a big part of why I do this. Biologically, we are all nurturing and communal. How do I know that biologically? Because we have mandatory midwifery. We must have community to help birth our children. Mandatory midwifery is because of the shape of our head, the shape of our shoulders, and the pelvic outlet. You got to turn your baby twice to get them out. So you need help. So we must have community to give birth of our children. We also have 5 brain development stages or life stages between neonate and adult. Those brain development stages are why we have the malleability of our brain, why we like to think smart. I question that a lot. Why we're so intelligent, right? Is because of that malleability of our brain. And that is because of the longer stages of brain development that we have than any other animal on this planet. There's a couple other animals. The highest that I have heard of is like 8 years from firstborn to adult. Ours is 25 years. And because of that, we need to be nurtured through those time periods. They did studies in the 50s that taught us failure to thrive exists. They did studies where they put orphans in 2 separate rooms. In one room, they gave them attention and love. And in one room, they just gave them their bottles propped up. And the ones in the room where they never got touched actually died. Right. So we know that failure to thrive exists. We know that nurture is needed. And we also know that we must have nurture to grow our brains, to understand, to come up with thought processes, to learn. Right. We know that it takes many different concepts and ideas of nurturing for one person to learn all the different concepts that they need, right? We're very knowledgeable people as a species. We really like to learn, right? And so we know that it takes multiple strains of knowledge coming in for a child to learn everything. So these 2 things tell us that biologically we are nurturing and communal. We live in a time when we are being gaslit that nurture and community is bad. How dare you feed the homeless, right? We live in a time when we're being taught those things are pretty evil. And because we're living in a time when we're being taught those things are very wrong and we aren't receiving any nurture or community, many of us are depressed or anxious, or we think there's a problem. There is a problem, but you are not the problem. The problem is society. And your response to an unhealthy society is a very healthy response. Depression and anxiety and being aware that there's a problem is a very healthy response to a very unhealthy society. So life comes with necessity, right? Like being alive comes with certain necessities. And those necessities include nurture and community for Homo sapiens. And since that necessity includes nurture and community for Homo sapiens, you are worthy of nurture and community just by breathing. You are worthy of love and grace just by being alive. You are worthy of the things that are necessary for your life just by being alive. So please remember to give yourself grace today. Please remember to give yourself love today. Please remember that even though many of us feel all the time like there are not people that love us around us, there are absolutely people around you who love you. You may not see them, but they are absolutely there. And I am here. And I love each and every one of you just because you exist, just because you're alive, just because you're a part of trying to make these things better. If you can see that there's a problem, then you are a part of the solution, because we can't fix shit if we're not aware that there's a problem. So when you see that there's a problem and you're able to be a part of the solution, that means I love you more, because you're going to help us get the fuck out of this shit. And that also means that you're way more worthy than somebody who is blindly turning their eyes to it, of love and community, because you know that there's a problem and you know that there's a need to fix it. How do we fix it? It's real simple. It's land back on a global scale. Tending and governance to Indigenous communities on a global scale means that we would absolutely end the climate destruction that we're causing. And it would also mean, because animism and Indigenous community, almost all, and of course, nothing is monolithic, but animism and Indigenous community tends to have community, tends to take care of the whole, and tends to take care of everybody within and everybody involved. So returning tending and governance of the land and the community to Indigenous people across the globe means that we end climate destruction across the globe. It means that we end this exploitation that all of us are dealing with at this point in time. It means that we return to community. There are Indigenous nations across the globe. In every country, there are Indigenous nations. And if we can return tending and governance to those Indigenous nations, land back on a global scale, we can change where we're at. We can take care of the last 10,000 years of violence and destruction and return to a communal time from before. That's why I'm here. I just hope everybody hears that. And I hope you all hear that there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not the problem. You're part of the solution. The problem is the society within which we live. The problem is the people up on top who are trying to exploit you and take everything they fucking can from you. And you are a part of the solution. You're a part of the good. Much love, everybody. Take care. I'll try and come back in a couple of days and we'll talk more. Have a great one. If I can figure out technology, because, it wanted to stop on me all the time, but now it won't. Goodbye, YouTube. Take care, everybody. Have a grand day.